Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the Richmond Art Gallery's May 2020 session of the Artist Salon. Tonight we have our guest, Lou Sheppard, who's right here. My name is Kathy Tycholis. I am the Richmond Art Gallery's Education and Public Programs Coordinator and host of the Artist Salon series. This free program is continuing to come to you each month as part of the Richmond Art Gallery Association's programming. And I would like to acknowledge and give thanks that I am able to continue meeting with you all virtually from my home, which is located on the unceded ancestral traditional lands of the Musqueam, Tsleil-Waututh, and Squamish nations of the Coast Salish peoples, otherwise known as Vancouver, BC. And for those of you new to the Artist Salon program, it is a program for visual artists to hear from other working art professionals for inspiration, career insight, tips, as well as a space for Lower Mainland artists to meet together, even if it's virtual. I do try to bring in presenters that reflect your interests. So if you do have a topic or a person that you would like to see this year, please feel free to reach out to me through email. And also you will be getting a survey for those attending the live session. Please feel free to add in there of speakers you might want to see. Another aspect of our salon is the Facebook group. So the Richmond Artist Salon exists as a Facebook group where we post opportunities, art calls, calls for proposals. So first I will introduce our guest, then I will disappear into the background for a while, and then I'll return as the question period comes up again. So for tonight, our guest is Lou Sheppard, the current artist in residence at Branscombe House here in Richmond. Lou is a Canadian artist working in interdisciplinary studio, performance, and installation-based practice. They have exhibited in Canada and internationally, notably in the Toronto Biennial, in the Antarctic Biennale, and the Antarctic Pavilion in Venice. In 2017, Lou received the Emerging Atlantic Artist Award, and in 2018, they were an international residency recipient of the Sobey Art Award. And also just recently in 2020 also got the Sobey Art Award. Congratulations, yay. So I won't say much more about the work because I think Lou will be here to do that for us and also be talking about Branscombe House for those of you who don't know about that, as well as their experiences at residencies in general. So I will leave it to you, Lou.
So I wanted to say before I get started, thanks so much to the Richmond Art Gallery for having me. I feel really lucky to be in Richmond this year. It's a really amazing city in terms of the support that it has for artists. And I've been really reaping those benefits and really enjoying being a part of a city that does so much and supports so much art happening. I'll be doing a public art project as well as working as the Branscombe House Artist-in-Residence and hoping to maintain those ties past just this year. So I've been really, really happy to be here. Like Kathy said, Richmond is of course on the unceded and traditional ancestral territories of, I know the Musqueam Nation is quite close by. One thing I've been thinking about a lot while I'm working and presenting online is about the idea that we also need to continue to support Indigenous sovereignty and futurity in virtual space. And so just wanted to put that out there as something that I think as we start to move our programming onto the internet more, how do we make sure to still think about and prioritize and make space for Indigenous voices? I am originally from Nova Scotia, which is a long ways away, and it's hard to be away at a time like this, I'll be honest, from home. I've been missing it quite a bit. I grew up in Nova Scotia, understanding that I was really connected to and like part of that place. So I grew up as a person of Scottish settler heritage. So I grew up like sort of seeing my heritage reflected all around me. Nova Scotia is called New Scotland. And so I really thought of myself as being of that land and as of having been born there, and that being like really the place that I was from. When I started to understand that Nova Scotia had other names that it had been called before, it was called Nova Scotia. Mostly that it was called Mi'kmaq by the Mi'kmaq people, who are the traditional and indigenous people of Nova Scotia, or of Mi'kmaq. I started to understand that the names and the languages that we have for places are actually shape how we understand and change how we understand a place. So what I mean is, when I call Nova Scotia, when I call where I'm from Nova Scotia, I think about my own Scottish heritage and I think about my own connections there. When I call where I'm from Mi'kmaq, I start to understand that I'm a guest there and I'm a settler there. And so that idea of how language changes how we think about place has really taken me through a lot of my practice. And you'll see that a lot of the way that I work is thinking about and looking at how language structures our understanding, and in many different ways. So while I'm talking tonight, I'm going to talk about a few different projects, and I'll talk about them in relation to specific residencies that I've done. The idea being that I want to give you guys a sense of my practice and share with you a bit about what I do, but also about how that practice is related to place and to residencies, and how I've used residencies to support my practice, which is something that is really interesting, I think, and something to think about as an artist. And then we'll talk more specifically. So we'll I'll talk about my practice and these residencies in the first part, and then we can stop and ask questions about, or like have a quick conversation about that. And then for the last little bit, I'll work in some very specific points about how to apply for residencies, and sort of like real specifics like proposals and juries and what juries are looking for and that kind of thing, funding opportunities, etc. So I wanted to kind of divide it into two parts, recognizing that maybe people would want to see both those things. So I'll say that, and then I'll get started. So this question around language and about how language shapes our understanding of place took me on a kind of interesting journey to Antarctica, actually. Oh, I'll make sure I can share here. Here's my studio. I was able to go aboard a ship that was going to Antarctica as part of a project called the Antarctic Biennial, which was kind of a wild idea of taking artists by sea to Antarctica to stage a biennial on the Antarctic continent, which is like a wild and hubristic idea, but off we went. So what I was interested in was the idea that when we think about Antarctica, we often think about it as a really remote place. We often only really know about Antarctica through sort of scientific data or mapping or cartography. Like, we don't often get an experience of the place as a place where people live, or like what it actually feels like to be there. So I decided that what I'd do is I'd take these maps of Antarctica that I could find, these like sort of satellite imagery and sort of on, I was using Google Maps, so like looking at what Antarctica kind of was represented as. And I notated those maps as can you see my cursor? I hope so. I notated the maps as a musical score. So I wanted to almost perform like a metaphoric shift between this language of mapping and then this language of music, to ask like what happens when we start to think about places but in different languages, and we start to work between different languages to understand place. So this is a portion of that map that turned into a score. And these are actually like there's about 20 feet of this. And the map follows the journey that the ship took along the Antarctic Peninsula, which is beautiful. And here I am presenting this work on the Antarctic continent. So this is actually just at a place called Winter Island, and it's near a Russian base called the Vernadsky Station. It's a pretty wild experience. When I started this project, I just go back when I just wanted to mention, just like, because I looked at this photo for the first time today and thought like, oh, it's so funny to see this. I I had just quit my job I had worked in education, and I'd stopped working in education because I got this opportunity to go on this ship. I was really low on money at this point. I think I got on the plane to go here with $200 in my bank account, and I'd asked my parents to watch my bank account in case I got into trouble. I was like, just be forewarned that I might be like, I'm traveling internationally, I have no money. And I was able to do this because I saw an open call and I proposed this project, and they took me up on it basically. And they said, okay, as a relatively unknown, well, I mean, really unknown artist at that point, we'll take you up on this and we'll pay for you to come with us. So I encourage you, if you're artist thinking about doing something pretty wild, or you look at an opportunity and you think like, there's no way I could ever do that. I'm here to tell you that sometimes you hit the right button and you figure it out. So yeah, this was a really sort of the start of a pretty amazing set of experiences that I've been able to do. And I really encourage you to not be too shy to actually go after these kinds of opportunities, because they are out there. So after having the experience of like being in that place in Antarctica and thinking about what it actually meant to be there, I started to think about this idea of sea ice loss and of the loss of ice at the poles. And every summer, as you probably know, the sea ice in the Arctic melts back quite a bit, and it reforms a little bit in the winter. But as time goes on and as climate change goes on, we're losing more and more sea ice over time in the Arctic. And the same goes for the Antarctic. In their winters, which are our summers, they're gaining sea ice and losing it in time, like sort of in time with us. So it's almost as though there's a sort of back and forth that happens between the two poles. And so I was kind of curious about this idea of losing sea ice, because I think it's one of those major warnings that we get from climate change, where it's like the sea ice is melting, the sea ice is melting. And as somebody that doesn't live in the north, I didn't really know what that meant. But again, I was thinking about these experiences of language and how looking at things through different languages can shape our experiences of them. And so I took a bunch of sea ice data that I was able to access online through an online database through the National Snow and Ice Data Center. And I translated that data into music, or into like a musical notation, so that I was able to see and hear what this loss of sea ice sounded like. So the image that you can see right now is the darker, so at the top of the screen, the darker notes are from 2019, January 1st, 2019. And that's what the Arctic sea ice looked like at that time. And the ghostly notes behind it are what the sea ice looked like 20 years earlier, or 1990. How many years ago was that? So that's January 1st, 1990. So you can see that over that time, there's been quite a change in how the ice actually forms and shrinks. And what I wanted to do, and I'm just gonna do a little like fancy footwork here, is I built a program to actually be able to listen every day to what the sea ice sounded like. So when I press this button, you'll be able to hear what the sea ice sounds like. Actually, it lags just a couple of days. So it's May 23rd, 2020. This is what the sea ice sounds like. I'll stop it there. So back to my presenter view. So of course, I didn't build that computer program on my own. I don't have a programming background. I went to art school and then I studied English, which is where my sort of interests come from. But I was able to make that program because I proposed it as a project to do at the Banff Centre. And the Banff Centre I'm sure most people are familiar with, especially out here because it's just over the mountain range in Banff, Alberta. But it's a pretty incredible place for artists to go and develop projects, to work with uh, specific faculty and mentors, to work with other artists, uh, and to get access to equipment and to technical expertise that otherwise you wouldn't have access to. So I was able to go to Banff and produce that program with a programmer. There was a programmer on staff who worked with me to make that program. His name is Kenny Lazowski. He's since sadly moved on, but there's other people there that are just as knowledgeable. And I was also able to go in and access all of this incredible equipment to then think through how to present this work. And so this is just like a shot that we were setting up in one of the studios. I was able to use a couple of grand pianos and able to stage a performance of this work. And so again, thinking about how artists get to make work, and when you look at artists' work and you say, like, I'm not sure how I could ever do that, programs like the Banff Centre do give you access to facilities and technical expertise that you might not otherwise have. And we'll talk about funding in terms of like we'll talk about funding later in terms of how you might start to fund projects like this. But I will say that Banff you are often able to get funding through Banff. So if you've been thinking about going to Banff, I highly recommend it. It's pretty unique all over it's a pretty unique program in terms of the rest of the world as well. Okay, so switching gears and still thinking about this idea of language and of music and of sort of like environment and of climate change and of what's sort of happening in terms of environmental devastation. I was able to go on a retreat style residency, which means that I was going by myself to basically like a place where I was going to be alone for a couple of months. And the residency was called the Doris McCarthy Residency. This is a residency that has an annual open call. They choose, I think, between 6 and 8 artists to go every year. And you go at separate times. So I was there for 2 months in June and July. I was there of 2018. And this is actually the home of Doris McCarthy, who is a Canadian landscape painter. And when she died, before she died, she wanted to establish her home as an artist residency with the idea that artists would go there, not necessarily to even make work, but that they'd go there to have a space to reflect and to heal and to regenerate. And recognizing that that our practices don't always look like sitting down at a desk at 9 in the morning and getting up at 5 in the afternoon and saying, okay, I've done a day's work. Places like this are really pretty key in terms of supporting practice, because it gave me 2 uninterrupted months to just like really focus in, and where I wasn't having to think about other work or like other jobs that I was going to. I was just able to be there. I wasn't thinking about other social obligations. I was just really in this space. So Doris McCarthy's home sits right on this is actually the studio. I love this shot because I think that's Arthur Lismer that she painted. Her paintings were like all over the house. It was pretty wild. You're sort of living in a historical museum. Anyone who's interested in I guess in landscape painting, but also just in Doris McCarthy in general, this is a pretty incredible residency to do. Highly recommend it. And it, but this was the studio that I was in. You can sort of see. But what I wanted to do, or while I was there, I was thinking a lot about where the residency was and like where it was situated in space. And this residency sits on the shores of Lake Ontario. So this is like the view from my studio, and I was like looking out on this view every day. It's pretty dreamy. Pretty much miss it. And Doris had been a really avid birder, and she'd always collected and sort of cataloged all the birds that she had seen on the property over years and years and years of living there. So I wanted to think about those bird species and what had been there when she was living there, and sort of what was there now. or like how those bird species had changed, because I think it's pretty, well, I had done a lot of research that has shown me that bird species were really declining, and that there were less and less population of birds since I think we've like, I've read things that have said we've lost like 50% of the songbirds or something in our world. So what I decided to do is I was thinking again about the sound of the birds that the birds were making, and also the languages that we had to hear those sounds. And so one of the languages that we have to hear bird sounds is called a spectrogram, and it's actually a visual representation of the sound. If anyone's like a birder or a biologist or has like a linguist friend, or might be a linguist themselves, or a linguistics major. Spectrograms are used to study sound and to study specifically communicative sound and language. So a spectrogram is like almost like a little waveform, and you look at it and you can see really specifically what's happening in a sound. You can see how it's shaped and how it's strong in some parts and is less loud in other parts, and how the pitch goes up and down, and all of these sort of different nuances of what a sound might look like. So I was thinking about these spectrograms, and so I decided to hear all the birds that I could and identify them by ear as best I could. And I learned how to do that while I was there with the help of a birder friend, thankfully, or a couple birder friends. And I then was able to take their spectrograms, the bird spectrograms, and create a series of graphic scores, or like almost like musical notation, that notated the patterns of how the birds would start singing in the morning and how they'd end off singing at night. So these are what you're seeing on the screen right now are two graphic scores. And a graphic score is something that a musician can take and play that's not in a traditional musical notation, but is in a more visual musical notation, and it's a more open system of interpretation than, say, like the notes that I've been using earlier. But this contains a lot of textural and textural, not textual, but textural information, and also information about duration of sound. And you can sort of start to think like, what might those shapes sound like? And so these two pieces are called dawn chorus and evensong. The idea being that the dawn chorus is the pattern of birds singing in the morning, and evensong I borrowed from Anglican prayer service at night when you're sort of doing your last evening prayer and saying goodnight. And so I often take, I guess, yeah, I sometimes borrow terminology that comes from like a religious ceremony. I've done a lot of work that has been called requiems, because I think it's interesting to start taking that terminology and applying it to a kind of more secular understanding of our world. I'm starting to say, you know, where did these experiences of sacredness exist in our experiences that don't have to do with these established religions, maybe. So dawn chorus and evensong, I made with the idea that this was what I could hear June 2018, and thinking this would have been really different from what Doris would have been hearing when she was living at the house. And it will be very different than what is heard there even this year, 2 years later. So it's kind of a way of providing a reflection of a place. And that was something I really wanted to do with that piece, or with that residency, is be able to give like a reflection of what it was like to be there. Because in truth, the process of being there was more about me just being in the space and retreating and being present, rather than creating a piece with a specific, I don't know, facility, or like having like a specific project in mind going in. But one really lovely thing about that project, and I was able to do, is because it was the reflection of a place, I was then able to show it in Toronto as a kind of piece that was made about Toronto, or about an experience of being in that area. So this is at the Toronto Sculpture Garden, and for artists who are interested, Sculpture Garden has open calls So you can look, it's like a public art project. So you do it in collaboration with the city. And I think they have open calls throughout the year. You can kind of check out the Toronto City website and see. This one was, it was an open call. So I was able to apply with this project, and it was in partnership with the Toronto Biennial. So it was specifically presented as part of this larger exhibition, but it also existed in this sort of isolated green space that's like in a courtyard in downtown Toronto. So the project takes those two compositions that I showed you, and then it extends them over 14 or 15 hours. I think it's 14 hours. And it plays them on 8 different channels so that you get this kind of echoing experience as you're listening to it, where you're sort of bouncing between these different speakers. And what I wanted to do is create an experience of hearing a kind of analog piano translation of these bird songs, and then working towards a more digital translation of the bird songs. So thinking about this move from an analog like sort of representation to a more digitized space, and thinking again about these like sort of degrees of loss between languages, of something like going from a piano note to a synthesizer note to a synthesized sound, and into a kind of like feedback sound. I'm just going to play you a little quick clip of this. So it starts off and you'll hear the more piano music, and then you will get to a more digitized sound. I'll end it there. And I should say that I made that piece in collaboration with Pamela Hart, who is somebody that is my partner, but is also somebody that I'm collaborating with more and more in my practice. She's a sound engineer and a musician, and also an audio expert, and is a pretty amazing person to get to work with. And so she really was able to keep this project on the rails. This was like way over my head in terms of anything I'd done before, and having someone who had experience with like technical equipment working with me meant that I could do something on a scale that was way over and above something that I'd done before. So again, nothing that an artist does, or I shouldn't say nothing, but very little that I do in my practice happens alone. I work in my studio and I sort of think in my studio, but I'm always talking to people and sort of reflecting ideas back and forth. And then when it comes to actually making the work, it's often made with a lot of help, and often that changes it, and it means that it becomes something bigger or different than it would have been. And I find that a really exciting and beautiful process about making work. And the larger I'm able to think, the more people get involved and the project shift, and that feels really exciting to me. So just one last bird project, because I'm pretty obsessed with birds, or I feel like 2018, maybe 2019 was like year of the bird for me. I was just like all birds all the time. So I did a project at a gallery called Struts Gallery. It's in Sackville, New Brunswick, probably one of the coolest towns I've ever been to, small towns. Highly recommend this. It's again, open call, Artist Run Center. You apply to do their residency program. You come in for a month and you work in their space. They have a lot of great equipment, cameras, recorders, a gallery space that you work in, and a community that's really committed and involved with the arts. They have Mount Saint University nearby, so there's a lot of back and forth between those two institutions. Oh, I can hear some music on the street. Apologies if that's interrupting you. hopefully that'll die off soon. But at Struts, I was thinking about the birds that were in the Sackville area and what was perhaps had been gone extinct from the Sackville area. And there's 3 different birds that have gone extinct, or like that kind of went extinct before a recording equipment existed to record what their calls sounded like. So I wanted to think about how those calls had attempted to be translated, or how people had attempted to remember what they sounded like. So the text that you see on these street banners is actually text of people trying to remember or recall what the calls of certain birds were. And so this is I think this is the Labrador duck, and I love the idea of just encountering this sign and it's saying low croaking, a hoarse call, a gurgling sound, and you can imagine that, of course, like that sound existing in the world wouldn't be that strange, but then when you see an attempt to give it another language, attempt to translate it into English, you end up with something that almost becomes kind of absurd. Another project that I did at Struts that I'm hoping to do here in Richmond, if I get a chance, is a chorus of people singing bird calls of birds, thinking about calling birds back to their traditional nesting areas, or thinking about sending them on their way in the fall on safe migration. And so we were able to stage a choir of community members and sing together in the marsh that is in Sackville. It's a pretty great experience. Again, Pamela helped me direct that choir, and thankfully, because I was over my head with that. So to get away a little bit from birds for a minute, although not completely, they're always near my heart. This is another studio, another residency that I did. This is my studio at Cite Internationale des Arts Internationales. It's in Paris. And this used to be what was called the Canada Council Studio in Paris. So basically the Canada Council used to fund an artist to go and live in Paris for a period of time, and to work in the city for a period of time. If you know Katie Belcher, who's the director of Access, she was able to do this residency a few years ago, and she did some pretty amazing work as part of this residency. When I did the residency, the Canada Council had stopped funding their international studio in Paris, but the program still existed. So I applied directly to the residency program and then applied to Canada Council and got funding to do it. So just if people are thinking like that they've missed their chances on these international residencies because Canada Council has changed their funding model, if that's like something that's in your mind, you can still apply to these places like Le Cité in Paris, like ISCP in New York, and get funding through Canada Council to do these sort of bigger international residencies. That's still very much a possibility. This studio looked out over a highway of cars and then onto the River Seine, which is pretty incredible. And it was just pretty amazing to be in Paris as a city. And I was there to work on a couple of different projects, but I was really there just, again, to spend time and have uninterrupted studio time. And while I was there, I was thinking a lot about this idea of language and about the environment, and also about bodies and how language and bodies, or how the language we have to talk about bodies shapes our understanding of bodies, and also how we might start to think about our bodies in relation to our environment. So while I was in Paris, I started a project called Continental Drift, thinking about this idea of continents moving very slowly, like the tectonic shift of plates. And I heard this analogy in my research of tectonic plates moving they would move as much as your hair would grow in a year, or they would move as much as your fingernails would grow in a year. I don't know if you've heard that analogy. It's likely not true. It's just like a poetic idea that I was quite interested in. So I needed a way of marking time, because I was going through some personal stuff that was really difficult, and I needed a way to kind of like mark my time through it as a ritual. And I also was interested in this idea of my body becoming a kind of geologic clock, or thinking about geologic time in relation to my body. So I shaved my head in Paris, which was like interesting. Interesting to be in a country where you don't know a lot of people, and it's a very fashionable country, and then to be like, I'm going to shave my head and see what that's like. So that was an experience. I shaved my head, and this is you can see the photo of me on the very first day, looking pretty rough. It was a pretty intense experience. And I took a photo and put it on my Instagram every day, all the way down to the end of 2018. And that's a photo of me just like at the very bottom of your screen. And that's how much my hair grew. And so this is the hair that I was left with. I shaved it off again. And this was my sort of geologic record kept on my body. And there's my fingernails. I apologize, they're so gross. It's actually a lot of nail polish on there. Say that. So here's another shot of my studio in Paris. So other than thinking about this Continental Drift project, and probably why I was thinking so much about bodies, because I was there working on a larger project called A Strong Desire that I've done, that I've has sort of developed over a longer time. So I'll just check my time here. I'm doing well. I'm good. So A Strong Desire started with this idea of language and how language shapes bodies. And it came about because I was actually looking at a very specific piece of text that was very, shaping my experience of my body quite a bit. And so I was seeking or at a certain point, I was seeking diagnosis of gender dysphoria, looking to get a diagnosis of, basically it's like a medical diagnosis of being trans. And so gender dysphoria is a term that the Diagnostic Statistical Manual uses to say that you have an experience of your gender that is other than, how do they say it? Sort of other than what we assume an experience of gender is in a cisgendered person, which is like, all of which to say this is a very complicated and arbitrary piece of diagnostic text. And so I was looking at this diagnostic text and thinking about the way that I could prove that I was actually having this experience. And so I was looking at this and attempting to fit my body and my experiences into this text and into like the markers in this text. And what I started to think about more than the text itself was all the spaces in between this text, the spaces in the words of this text, where actually there was like room to breathe, or there are these moments of queerness within this text that were not about a distinct definition, but were these sudden gaps and these spaces where actually there could be something else in it. So what I did, I used another language, another notational language. This is Livan Notation. It's a dance notation language. If anybody's a dancer, you'll likely have seen this. It's a bit of a contested language. It's sort of funny and I guess esoteric in a way. But it's interesting for me because each one of these little symbols tells you an exact way to move. So it gives you an exact direction of how to move your body. So I was able to find these shapes of these symbols in the spaces between the text of this diagnostic criteria. And then I was able to translate those shapes into a series of movements that became a dance or became a movement sequence. So I worked with a dancer to develop these shapes and movements into an actual dance piece. And we performed that in Halifax as part of another, we managed to get a residency time working in an artist-run center. So we were able to be there to develop that piece together. And then I was asked by Cheyenne Tyrions at a Dane gallery at Simon Fraser to come and represent this piece, or like rethink it to be an installation as part of a larger show with Gabby Dow and Raven Shakan. It was a really amazing show. I felt really lucky to have my work in that space. And what's happening is I'm now taking some of these movements, I'm taking a sort of like repeated sequence of movements from this text, and I'm performing them on the wall of the gallery to create, to create a drawing that exists in the space. And I think of this drawing as being a kind of score. You look at it and you can then interpret it as a series of as a notation, as a language, as a series of actions that have been made and recorded and could lead to another kind of movement. So when I installed the piece, I wanted to have gym mats on the floor because I wanted this idea of people actually taking their shoes off and like getting on those mats and maybe moving themselves and thinking about how their bodies moved and how their bodies were constructed in relation to language, and then also how their bodies could resist the language that constructs them. So that's a strong desire. I just got two more, or like one more sort of piece to talk about, and then we'll pause for questions. And then we'll move into the sort of like more residency side of things, or I guess I got a few more, but not too much. So continuing this work around my body and around thinking about how bodies exist in space and are constructed in space. This was a project that I started developing in New York, and I'm not going to get too far into it, but I did a residency in New York at ISCP. It stands for the International Studio Curatorial Program. Again, a really, truly tremendous program for if you're able to go, you can get funding through Canada Council. You apply to ISCP and then you get your acceptance, and then you go to Canada Council and you say, I've been accepted and I'd like to go. And Canada Council will say, yeah, maybe, yes, no, maybe so. And so it's a really worthwhile residency to do. I actually did this one as part of the Sobey Foundation, so a little bit of a different process, but still highly recommend it. So this project was a piece called Crepuscular Rhythms. Crepuscular is this word that I came across. If you're not familiar with it, it means active at dawn and dusk. And so it's like usually used in biology. And it can also refer to like partially shaded. And so sometimes people can say like crepuscular in terms of like clouds and like the sun coming down through the clouds. But I was thinking about this idea of being active at dawn and dusk being these kinds of queer times of day, and perhaps even providing cover for queer bodies in space. And so it being a kind of thinking about this idea of like movement at dawn and dusk being about liminal time, or like time when we're coming in and out of form. And so thinking about that in relation to bodies and queerness, but then also thinking about safety and about cover for bodies. And that came from a conversation with a curator that I was working with in Calgary. And I was thinking about this idea, and I created this score, which actually became a score for an installation. And I could break down the score for you, but just to say, it sort of notates the angles of dawn and dusk, and it shows us that actually there's three different kinds of dawn and dusk. There's astronomical dawn, nautical dawn, and civil dawn, which I find just so truly beautiful. And these occur at different times when the sun hits like different angles below the horizon. And I wanted to evoke these times of day and this idea of like the passage of bodies through this time of day. So I took a series of t-shirts and I treated them with cyanotype chemicals, and I then wore them on a series of walks at these specific times of day through the city that I was living in, which was New York. And so I was like walking through and gathering this kind of exposure of light, and then presenting them in the gallery space as this. And so this is work that really this is a pretty big departure in my work from what I was doing before. And I really think came from that experience of being in a whole new city and surrounded by a whole new way of thinking about work. And so something that is, I think, really valuable about residencies is that it really shifts the way that you understand your practice. And it allows you to take your practice out of something that is fairly well established and say, I'm going to just move it and look at it in relation to a whole other world. So to accompany that piece, I also created another dance piece that was about language and about finding the space of movement, finding movement around language. So this is a series of scores that scores the dictionary definitions for man and woman, or these like words of man and woman, and then finds finds the finds sort of similarly to the strong desire piece, finds these sort of directions at the edges of that language, thinking about how somebody encounters that language and how a body is hailed into that language and perhaps even can resist that language. And then I was able to work, so these pieces were installed in relation to each other eventually. They were made in my studio at the same time. And I was able to work with two dancers to create this piece. So I gave them the movement score as a sort of series of directions, and I asked them to think about their bodies encountering each other and finding each other in space, but also resisting each other in space, to think about that idea of resistance and as well as encountering. So I'll just play like quickly this clip. So this is Joelle and Liana working on that project. As the dancers that I worked with, they're pretty great, amazing to work with. And just suddenly I'm like, oh, am I still eating? And I wanted to show you the kind of behind the scenes shot of this to say that that I guess like, I guess I wanted to show you this to say that I was able to find this kind of incredible studio to work in, mostly because Joella was a student. And so we were able to access her studios to actually tape the piece in. So also thinking about this idea of like, how do we access and how do we make the work that we make? You know, sometimes it's as simple as like someone having access like as a student and getting to use those facilities. So just a shout out to that was useful. So now I'm at Branscombe House doing a residency here, and I'm actually not sitting in Branscombe House right now. I'm actually in Mount Pleasant in Vancouver, but this is my home at Branscombe House for the year. And I'm working on a bunch of different projects that are about engaging the community in different ways. So I'm not going to talk super long about them because I'm conscious of our time and I don't want to go over, but I think as my practice has developed and as I've been doing these residencies in more and more places, I've been really looking for ways to feel like I have a community to be around and to feel like I'm making a kind of impact and I'm making a kind of connection to a community. So, so coming here to Richmond has been a lot about wanting to be connected and wanting my practice to resonate. So this is a piece that I'm working on. It's called Magnetic Orientation. It's about the snow goose flock in Richmond. And I'm hoping that this will turn into actually like a strung instrument that can be played that follows the trace of the snow goose migration path from Richmond to Siberia and strings itself to magnetic north, which is how the geese actually navigate their way to and from home. So I've been thinking about this idea of the geese being caught in this push and pull of orientation and how they find home by resisting a pull and also by following a pull. And I'm hoping that this will become like an instrument that could be played, like almost like a musical instrument, and also that it might exist as an aeolian harp that could be heard when wind flies through it. So this is like a kind of drawing that is like thinking my way through this idea of the geese and the harp itself. Another project that I'm doing here in Richmond is actually one that I developed while I was at McGill University as an artist-in-residence there. And I wanted to do a project that was about thinking about all the different languages that were spoken, first at a place like McGill, where people are coming in from all over the world to study in English. And then in a place like Richmond, where we have so many people that are speaking other languages at home, and then speaking English as they go about their sort of day in the world. And so wanting to explore what that process of like translating your experience into English is. So this project is called What We Can't Say in English, and you might have seen some calls for it. And I'm still collecting words that can't be translated from other languages into English, words that don't have an English translation, and taking those words and then attempting to define them through English. So like kind of like thinking about like how can we sort of give ourselves a bit of a window into what this is. And since the pandemic and like the lockdown, I've been actually developing this as a podcast with the idea that that this could exist as something that people could listen to and participate in that way. So I've been thinking a lot about like, what does it mean to engage community when we don't have the ability to meet up in person? And what does it mean to maybe think our way through platforms other than Zoom? Love Zoom, but what happens off of Zoom, or what other ways can we start to think about how we can connect? So this will become a podcast, but if you are a speaker of a language other than English and you have a word that doesn't translate, please would you submit it to me and email it to me, and we can start chatting about it. This one I thought was so beautiful. Sobremesa was given to me by an international student named Philippe, and he said, this is literally like the experience of sitting around after the table, after dinner is finished, but you haven't cleared the table and you talk. And I just thought it was so lovely, because actually we do that sometimes we do that as a, you know, in our family dinners, but I don't have a word for it in English. And that means that it's actually like it's not like sort of embedded into our routine, into our understanding. But he was saying it to me, and I realized also that this was not just the word was missing from his vocabulary in English, but this experience was missing for him in his experience of being in Canada. So I think, again, this idea about language and about how language shapes our experiences has taken me in so many different directions, and this is like one of them, I guess. I've also been working on a quarantine cookbook of your favorite recipes. So this is a really amazing recipe that was submitted to me and has now exists in the quarantine cookbook for gnocchi. I love this setup. And I've also been working on a series of dance scores that hold you in social distancing. So this is a dance score that will keep you 2 meters apart from your 7 other partners, and the 7 partners come from an idea of bird flocking behavior and looking at how birds actually fly in formation when they're doing a murmuration, you know, and they actually like keep themselves from smashing into each other. And this will be painted, something like this will be painted in the Lansdowne parking lot over the next little bit. So you'll be able to go and kind of have this hopscotch extravaganza of moving through this dance choreography. And the final piece as part of my Richmond work right now is simply gathering statements from people about what they miss since the lockdown has happened, and what they want to change, or what they think they might change as we move into like sort of post-pandemic, if that's a possibility. And I'm going to take these statements and start projecting them in the windows of Branscombe House, because also thinking about how can I create the house is something that people can engage with. So if you're in the Richmond area over the next couple of weeks, you'll see these in the windows, mostly at night, because I don't think they really work during the day. I'm going to leave it there, and we can stop and kind of take some quick questions, and then we can move into the residencies portion of things.
All right, so thank you, Lou. That was great to see all the work and the residencies you've done. I was just curious about, so when you go into your residencies, do you feel like you have kind of an idea what you want to do? You know, whether it be birds, whether it be sound, or, you know, ice, relating to the ice, like, is that something you think about first, or does it happen once you're there?
It's an interesting balance, actually, because the place will always change the project. And I think a lot of us as artists are used to having to kind of speculate on what we might do in our studios, recognizing that the studio is that our practices are changeable, and that our work changes like as we go. So usually what happens is I'll propose a project to a residency and I'll sort of say, this is what I'd like to do. And by the time if that project like gets accepted, it's usually like a year later that you're actually going. And so like my practice has shifted, things have shifted for me, the world has shifted. Obviously I didn't start my project at Branscombe thinking about social distancing. I'd never heard of it. I was like, and I'll be honest, I had a few sleepless nights being like, how do I do community engagement in a pandemic? Which is what we're all doing. But I think, so yeah, I think it's a combination. Like, I think it's okay to not know what you're going to do, but you do need to give, or for me, like I think like I propose something and I sort of propose an idea, and I try to leave it as open-ended so that I can move through it and to work through it as I go. I've never had the experience of saying this is exactly what I'll do and having it be exactly what happened, because it's just like life. Life gets in the way of that. So.
Well, that ties into a question that I got emailed to me from Laura. So Laura was asking, even before you select a residency, so are you, thinking about what you might do in term, and that would be the one that you go for. So she was saying, so do you have this clarity and focus? You have this clarity and focus within your work, assuming there was a time when you were still figuring things out, or maybe you were always very clear in your mind what you were researching. Sort of what were your parameters in selecting a residency?
Mm-hmm. I mean, and don't forget that I'm showing this work after it's been made, and I could talk about, and maybe sometime it would be really interesting to present like, what is my practice right now? What am I working on? You would see like images of quarries. You would see a lot of stuff around like instrument notation, and none of it has come together yet. I'm not sure what it's going to be. So I think that's it. Like when we're looking back, it's easy to, like, I can kind of create a story that says, this is what happened here, this is what happened here. But in truth, I think the process is probably a bit more organic. It's like a bit of serendipity happened to say, oh, like suddenly I had this idea around birds, and then I find myself at the home of like a birder, like a sort of obsessive birder. But I do think there's a way of thinking about what you want to get out of a residency, and thinking about what your project needs. So I think there's some residencies that I've sort of gone for because I've known that I need a particular set of facilities, or like I need a particular like help to get something done. And that would be like an example of the Banff Centre. When I was there working on my polar region project, I went in with that fairly clearly established, and then left with like something that looked more or less like what I imagined it to look like. But I think often it's more about you see the opportunity, and then you start to think, well, how do I fit myself into that? If that opportunity calls to you, then like, how might your practice fit there? And so, yeah, it's sort of like I saw the McCarthy residency, and I thought, I really want to be there. I really want that time. And I want this time to think about place, and how am I thinking about and experiencing place? Well, part of it is through this idea of like what I can hear. And I actually didn't know that Doris McCarthy was a birder, was such an avid birder, until I got there. And then I was like, whoa, this is like maybe a bit of magic that happened. So that's like a weird answer to say yes and no, I guess, is the answer. Sometimes it's luck, and sometimes, when I first started sort of applying to a lot of things, I thought, I want to kind of try and I want to see what can happen. And I want to sort of see where all the possibilities that are open to me. Now I am a bit more strategic, and I say like, okay, I want to go in, I want to connect to a community for a year. And I know that my work is like often reflecting the environment. So if I'm in Richmond and wanting my work to reflect the environment of Richmond, then what things do I know are in Richmond that I can begin to find in my practice? And like, where can I find those conversations? And that often happens through research and through talking to people. And at this point, I can also say like, this is a kind of way that I work, and knowing that I can bring that practice and that method of working to different places. Yeah.
Great. Are there any sort of either red flags that you would like let people know in terms of residency? Because there's just so much out there. Like when you start searching
Yeah,
online, there is tons and tons of residencies. So
totally.
how do you wade through all that?
Yeah,
And
okay. Yeah, this is really important. I'm going to just flip ahead to a slide ahead, and maybe I'll like look at this. Um, so this is I sometimes do, like I have done presentations all about just like how to access residencies, and I'm really happy to talk about that because I do think that there's a certain degree of this that is about understanding how a system works and understanding how you can access it, and not being not feeling like this is not available to you, because as an artist these are really important resources that you should be that you should feel like are for you because they are for artists. So when I'm looking, or like when I tell people if they're looking for a residency, there's a bunch of questions that they should be asking themselves around around like if you're looking for something more like a retreat, or if you're looking to work in a group, if you're looking for a kind of, if you're saying to yourself, I need time and space, I need time and space, maybe you want to do something like a retreat. If you're saying something more like, I want to work with a group, I want inspiration, I want to kind of like feel that refresh of my practice, then maybe something like a group residency, like a cohort style, even a thematic residency might be more appealing. If you're looking for, if you have like a specific project in mind, then you might be looking to go to a specific place. But if you're looking more for general studio time, then you might be looking to how to fit your practice into like a studio space. You might be saying like, okay, I want to go and spend this time, and I know I have these threads that I'm picking up in my work, and I want to develop these threads, rather than saying like I want to go and like make a series of works that are about a specific place, both of which can work for residencies really well. And thinking about things like if you want to go to a specific place, like if you're like, I've always dreamed as an artist to go to Paris, and your answer is, and then someone says, well, why? And your answer is like, well, duh, Paris. That's not going to, that's going to not going to necessarily be compelling to a funding body or to a residency body to say like, yeah, we'll bring you. But if you want to go to a place like Paris, think about why, like think about what's actually resonating for you there, and where and why you might work there, and how your practice might shift there. And that will really be compelling to a jury, to a residency body. And that is how you start to get to, I guess, like find yourself in these spaces where you're like, oh, I've always dreamed of that, but really thinking, well, what is it specifically that I've dreamed of, and trying to be quite specific in your proposal. So when you're looking at residencies, there's actually no, this is my like long answer to the red flag, there's no regulatory body of residencies. There's no group of people that look and say, stamp, yes, this is a residency, we approve of it. And that means that artists have to kind of do this work on their own. So I would say if you're looking at a residency opportunity and it's like, come live in our Italian villa and like eat our beautiful grapes and like look out at our beautiful countryside, then look and say like, how many thousands of euros is this going to cost me? Because often people kind of set up these experiences that are actually more about a romantic idea of what an artist is, and not about providing what an artist needs to work. So I would say like, look and see, do you know other artists that have gone, or can you see that like there is a group of, like you can see like on their website, here's like some of our past residents, and look and say like, do their practices match with mine? Do they look like, do these look like my peers? And also like talking to people and saying like, have you had bad experiences? Have you heard bad things, or have you heard anything? I know that I've had some friends that have gotten into some like difficult situations in residencies, because it is kind of a vulnerable time. Like you're going in with your practice and you're living in a whole new space and all of that. So I think be aware that not every opportunity is necessarily the right opportunity. But generally, if something has a lot of like, not generally, if something offers like some like a good studio space, offers you sometimes like residencies, I often look and say like, well, if you don't offer funding, is it at least like seems to be maybe a little bit subsidized so that I'm not paying like, I know that I'm not just like an Airbnb guest that's like maybe just coming in and paying your rent. So I kind of things like that, like use your sort of like critical thinking brain and ask, you know, like if you want to do a residency, ask them and say like, what is it that if I'm paying for this, like what am I paying for? And that's like a real point for people who are seeking funding too, because when you're seeking funding from a body like Canada Council, Canada Council will give you money to do all kinds of wacky things, but they won't give you money just to go and live in a beautiful place. You gotta justify why you want to be there. So if you're gonna try to seek funding to do a residency, I know there's this residency that's about like sailing on a boat up to the Arctic. It's called the Arctic Circle Residency, and everyone always asks me about it because I've done so much like work about this sort of thing, and they're like, oh, you must have done that residency. And I say, no, actually I haven't done that residency because it's really expensive. And I've never actually met someone who's gotten Canada Council funding to do it. And it hasn't been something that I've been able to like pay for out of pocket. Similarly, there's one in Brazil that's like, you go to the Amazon and live in the Amazon, and it's like, yeah, I've seen people request funding for that residency before and not get it because it's like, it's really, really expensive and it's not a real well-established residency. So it's really something to say, I guess. Yeah.
I'm still waiting for questions from people, so please type them in. But I was going to ask too, in relation to your Branscombe House, like, you know, and just even, you know, with everything that's going on right now, like how has that changed for you? And, you know, some residencies are only like a month or a few weeks versus a year, which Branscombe House is. Like,
yeah,
how has that changed for you knowing you're going to be here, you know, for the whole year?
Yeah, and thank goodness I am, because I think if this had happened and I had 2 months to work here, I don't know, like I don't think I could have adapted fast enough. Like it took me a good month of like, I think it took all of us a good month of like panic just to be like, what are we doing? How do we do this? So this is what I'll call the what now portion, because when we talk about residencies, we're talking about international travel. We're talking about going to live in a new place, maybe like among other people, and like all of these things suddenly seem like, is this going to be possible to do in the near future and even in the distant future? So I've been thinking a lot about like, you know, as an artist who gets a lot out of residencies and does a lot of residencies, I've been thinking like, how can I continue to access that support structure outside of a residency? So what can I do to connect with artists across country, like across internationally? What can I do to continue to connect to communities, even if it's like online or sort of adjacent to other people? And how can I continue to access the supports like curatorial support and like professional supports that residencies offer? And not just me, but how can we build these models to happen like for all artists? And I think this is something that we need to kind of deal with and figure out. A couple of notes on that. I have seen our residency starting to move online. And so if you're up for that, that is something that's happening. And I'm thinking about applying to one which is called the International LGBT Residency, which has gone online. And I think one of the things that I really like about this idea is that they've actually really set it up so that you have a lot of virtual time with each other. But you might see that more. You might see that more residencies are moving online, and you got to question yourself, like, well, what does that mean? And is this worth your participation? And definitely that would change like what you're paying for. So if you're looking at like paying a lot of money for something, you know, be thoughtful about what you're paying for. And also thinking a lot about this idea of like self-directing residencies. So if you can find a place to go, if you need a place like time and space for your practice, can you go somewhere like rent a cottage or like rent a small space or rent a room somewhere? Or even I've seen, when I was in New York, met quite a few people who were renting rooms just for like a month to be there by themselves and to kind of experience the city on their own. And that can be really hard. Like you don't have the support of the residency structure, but it does give you a lot of like autonomy around your time and your space. So that might be another way to think about it. Or I was also imagining with like a group of friends going to like a cottage and being like, we're going to do a residency together and let's talk about it. And maybe we can even get funding for it through a funding body. So all of that to say that like, I'm not panicked, but I'm definitely thinking about what this means. But I was thinking about what this meant even before this happened. Like this idea of travel, like the heavy international travel that artists do, is hard on our practices, and it's hard on the environment. And people have started to question, like, what does it make the best art? Like, does this idea of like moving your practice all the time, place to place, produce the best work? So I think we need to like think about what it is that we want to preserve from, or like what we can access and what we can do to support each other through this time, and to recognize that like we are rethinking everything. So all of that to say, like, I hope that we will have lots of residencies in the future. Right now it feels like everything's canceled, but hopefully things will start opening up again. But also all is not lost. You know, there's like still a lot of ways that we work as artists, like outside of these structures.
So we have one question about residencies and then two others that are more about your work.
Oh, cool.
So
Awesome.
Which one did you want to, which topic should?
Let's do the residency one, and then we can like talk more broadly.
Okay. So Joanne was asking, is there an ideal amount of time a residency should be to make it worthwhile? A minimum? Can it be too long? Is there a maximum?
Yes. All of those questions I could say yes and no to. I would say that no matter how long your residency is, you're going to go through a period of adjustment, and then you're going to go through a period of like heavy productivity, hopefully, and likely, and then you're going to go through a period of like saying goodbye. And so usually it's like, and my friend Katie, who has done lots of residencies, the director of Access, she describes it as like I think it's like a 2/3 and a third sort of thing, or like the first third of the residency is usually just like settling in and figuring it out. And it doesn't seem to matter how long the residency is. Like that time is generally, the residency is a week, then it's like the first couple of days you're like, what am I doing? And then you have this time that you kind of allow yourself to sink in, and then you also need to schedule in time to leave and to say goodbye to that time and space, even if it's just saying goodbye to your studio, or to kind of wrapping things up. I would say there's like, for me, I really love when I get to be in a place for like 2 months, 3 months, a year feels really luxurious. Not a lot of people can take a year out of their life to do a residency. Branscombe is really great because it's not like you're somewhere where you can't also perhaps like still have a job. So if somebody is an artist in this part of the world and is thinking about Branscombe and is like, I don't know if I could take that time, I found it a really wonderful place to like be a human being and also be an artist. Like I've been really enjoying that. I think that generally this idea around like a 2-week residency can be so invigorating for your practice, because you actually like go in and you're like, there it is. Like here's this like sudden burst of time. And you might find that I've had residencies that are 2 weeks long where it's been as productive as like 2 months in my studio, where I'm just like not, where it's like not coming together. And residency time is kind of like summer camp time. It's like, it's on a different clock. So it doesn't exist in the world in the same way. And suddenly you're like, your whole day is about being in your studio. And that means that you're actually like able to connect with your practice in a different way. So yes, I really think, I think that idea about like anywhere from like 2 weeks to like 2 or 3 months is like pretty amazing. And also I think do what you can and like take the space that you can, and don't worry that you don't have enough time. Like even if it's just something like saying, I'm going to take a day and it's going to be like a day to really focus in and almost be like a home residency. That's a really wonderful thing. So yeah.
Great. Good advice. So we'll move into your artwork. We got a question from Sonia. I see that you have a practice where you jump from one lexicon or medium into another, such as language, dance, sound, etc. Question is, have you always worked this way?
No, actually not at all. I started working out when I was in art school. I started working in video, did a little printmaking, and then I kind of found my home in the intermediate department. So I was thinking project to project in terms of like things would shift, and what I was doing would shift in relation to how I was thinking. But really, a lot of my projects and my work was shaped around video. And then I got a little bit stuck in video. I just like started to feel like I wasn't really sure what I was doing. I started to feel like I got a bit lost in the medium of it. And I was like really sort of like lost in this sort of like editing world. And I stopped making work for a while. I was sort of quite productive, like up until I was about 26. And then I really stopped working, and I decided to go back to school and I studied teaching, and to study teaching because I had a degree in fine art, I needed to do an upgrade. And so I needed to do basically an English degree to get a teaching certificate. And through doing that English degree, I started like thinking and wanting to participate in all these conversations and these like sort of ideas that I was having. And I realized that the way that I participate in those conversations is not only through talking, but also through making and through restructuring and through pointing and through installing and all of these sort of like mediums that I use. And so I started to kind of gain more confidence in that. And it was funny that like as I started teaching, I started actually practicing again as an artist. And so I got my teaching degree. I started teaching art in schools, and I started working alongside my students, which was like a dream, that I was able to kind of develop projects while I was working. But of course, for anyone who's been a teacher in public school, it's a full-time job. And it's like, it's a pretty incredible job, but it's really, wow, it's all encompassing. And so I was able to find some ways to back out of teaching, and sort of back out slowly as my practice started to kind of take over more and more, until I was able to like leave teaching altogether and start practicing full time. Although now that I do that, I miss teaching, which is like part of why I'm here at Branscombe, is because I miss being around groups of people talking about art and like around students thinking about art, and especially young people, because like as those of us that work with young people know, the work that they make is pretty incredible. It's like pretty out there, and it can be pretty challenging, and I found it super inspiring. So yeah, I think this way of working that is more about finding the language of the idea, has come from an ideas-driven practice. And so I think I really don't find myself working in a specific medium. I find myself working through specific ideas. And of course, like I do gravitate towards music, and I gravitate towards dance and gesture because I have access to that. But as I have access to more ideas or more possibilities, like the ideas find other ways, or I find other ways to talk about those or to express those. So I think that experience of suddenly working with cyanotype and t-shirts, I was like, what is this? This is not like, who am I? But of course, you know, and it's okay that it's not like I'm not a fabric artist, and I'm not creating something that's a fabric piece, because actually it's about a process, and it's about like finding the language of a process. And so what results is a record of that process. Yeah, I think like these questions that I have, and if you get the handout and you want to look at it, these questions are really about asking yourself why a particular residency connecting your practice to a particular space, and knowing, like being clear about why you want to be somewhere and what you want to, maybe not necessarily what you want to do, but why you want to do and why you want to go. And that's going to be compelling to a residency, to say, yes, come and do this with us. I think it's important to think that, like, when a residency or when a funding body takes you on or brings you in, or decides to support you, they're actually investing in you as an artist. They're investing in your practice over time. So thinking about, like, how the residency fits over a broader spectrum of your time, rather than just saying, like, well, this is a kind of one-off. It's like, well, I've been working on this for a while. I can develop it here, and then I can see it going here. That's definitely something to really think about in relation to how you incorporate residencies into your practice, and also that residencies are not all of your practice. I mean, they can be, and, like, I definitely tend to go from residency to residency because I actually don't have like a home right now other than Branscombe House, which can be, like, kind of challenging. I don't have an apartment, and that might shift. I'm, like, starting to get a little bit road weary, but yeah, I think also, like, residencies are a kind of way to really focus in on your practice, and then to recognize that your practice exists, like, in the rest of your life in different ways as well. So even if you're not able to practice every day, even if you're like working at a different kind of job, you're still practicing, or you're still thinking and creating, I guess, like, in your sort of day-to-day life. So to put that out there. But all of this stuff that I have about preparing submissions, and, like, these are my red flags, like, look at these and think, like, do I actually want to accept an offer? And also dealing with, like, potential rejection, which is, like, real. I can send these to folks, like, in a kind of compressed format.
That would be great.
Yeah, I'll just say one thing, and that's what you can see on the screen. Is, like, a really good piece of advice that I got. It's like, you aim for 100 rejections a year, and that's, like, maybe over the top, because that would be two applications a week that you were sending out, or more, because hopefully you get it accepted to some things. But the idea being that every time that you send an application out, it's an opportunity for a jury to look at your work. It's an opportunity to have thought through your work and to have presented it in a professional way. It's an opportunity to share your work with a whole group of people. And it's also, it's a kind of like you put it out there, and if you don't apply, then you definitely won't get it. And so you put it out there and you say, okay, when I get a rejection, it goes towards my tally of, like, I am moving and I am doing things and I am, like, definitely making progress. And so, yeah, I get like probably a rejection every, like, couple weeks, or, like, when I'm really going well, I know that that's a real marker that I'm, like, doing a lot, is, like, and of course they also kind of come in floods, like, because residencies sort of operate on a seasonal cycle. You get, like, April is always just, like, oh, like, the worst month, because you get so many rejections. And then, like, September, you're always just, like, applying. And then, like, again in October, you're just like, oh God, okay. So, rejections are a part of this, and, like, understanding that when you are asking and, like, putting your practice out there, a rejection is not a shutdown. It's a marker of you practicing, and that's part of it.
So as we're nearing the end, one last question. Is there a way to visit you while maintaining a physical distance, as in the front lawn of the Branscombe House Residency, or good, just online, or did you have other plans for events that might take place?
I want to start thinking about possibilities of doing outdoor social distancing things. And I've been talking to Richmond Art Centre, who's, like, kind of who houses me, about that possibility. And we are, like, in conversations about when and if that's going to be possible. Casually, I would say, like if somebody would like to do, like, a kind of, like, meetup on Zoom, maybe that's the easiest way, like, as we go. But my hope is that by sort of, like, late June, we might be able to think about meeting outdoors and kind of moving through the world outdoors a little bit together. That's like my hope. So yeah, let's hope for that. But yeah, if somebody's interested in, or like wants to kind of get in touch, email me and we can go from there in terms of setting something up. And yeah, hopefully if you're in Richmond and you want to see the projections in the windows, I'm hoping to get them started tomorrow night. We'll see how it goes. I'm just like working out a few bugs in the setup, but yeah.
Great. So yeah, I will include your notes, but I've also, while you've been doing your presentation, I included some of the links that you had talked about, places you talked about, including your website. So that would be the best way to find out what's happening at Branscombe House, I think, is just
I have a blog, so that everything goes there. And I'm working on, I also have an Instagram, and everything's on the Instagram, and that's like, I'm an Instagram person, so that's like the easiest. If you want to message me through there, I pick that up right away too.
Okay, great. I will be sharing this. This will be a part of our video that we create for afterwards. But as well, for anyone that participated tonight, I can send that up because I have all your emails. I can just send that to you all directly as well.
Perfect. Thank you.
I think that was it. So thank you everybody for coming today. And thank you so much to Lou. This was a great talk, really interesting to see your practice and just the diversity of it, and thinking about residencies and thinking about what they will be in the future as well.
Yeah, let's hope. Let's hope. Yeah, let's hope.
All right. Okay, well, thanks everybody. And I hope to see you back at the Artist Salon next month. So it'll be the last Tuesday of the month at 7 o'clock. So thank you. And thanks, Lou.
Bye, everybody.